啊啊，没有，没写，没写完。我感觉要再加一两个，或者丰富一下字数才可以。要再加两三
Okay,
页。
so today we're going to resume our conversation about the relationship between civic and religious architecture in
他主要说我的，
Renaissance, late medieval,
他主要说我
Renaissance
的论点论述
Italy.
还不够
Has everyone turned
清晰。
in their
我有一个论点，
exercises?
他就展开，就教他那个你说的地方。
So we left off last time we were in Florence, and we were looking at the town hall known as the Palazzo Vecchio, which is at the center of the city, and reviewing the ways in which the Palazzo Vecchio adheres to a building type for town halls from the 12th through the 16th century in Italy. And I want you to remember that while there are components of this typology that appear over and over again, that they take on a local inflection. Are the lights, should I lower the lights a bit more? It looks like this image is a bit dim. Yeah, okay. And so remember what the elements of that typology are. They include siting on a piazza, which is important for the representation of the people and the articulation of civic policies to the people. You need to have that open space. Remember that the building itself often takes on a very fortified identity, while at the same time, in the upper levels, having significant glazing, a fair bit of window that communicates, at least symbolically, the democratic nature of the government. So most of these governments were representational governments where the legislators were elected, and they wanted to project or communicate a kind of transparency within about the government. At the top of this building, you notice the kind of continuation of that fortified character with the arched machicolations. Yeah, yeah, is it, okay. Yeah. The machicolations and the crenellations at the top, and of course the bell tower, which communicated about times of day, but also different events that would happen in the square. Remember, we talked about it as a kind of medieval or Renaissance public address system. We ended by talking about the loggia in Florence, which is seen on the right of this image, the Loggia dei Lanzi. The loggia as a typology is not always attached to the town hall. Here it's detached and it's pretty monumental. The scale of the loggia differs from place to place. And so these elements that I've just reviewed, they show up all over Italy, but the things that change are aspects like the scale of the building, of the town hall and of the loggia, the material that they're built from, the siting is different from place to place. So to continue that idea, we're going to move on and look at this a similar example in Venice. So the city of Venice is located in the northeast of the Italian peninsula, and I'll show you a map in a second to kind of orient you geographically, but just to kind of explain a little bit about this city, which is highly unusual, I guess we could say unique. The city of Venice was founded probably in the 7th century, and it developed really as people were leaving the mainland of Italy, as barbarians came down from the north, different tribes came down from the north and invaded the peninsula. People fled the mainland, and you know that they had to be seriously desperate because they ended up building a civilization, a settlement in the lagoon of the Adriatic Sea, where there were, I don't think think we can even properly call them islands. They're more like mud flats. They're marshy, muddy, silted up areas, and they began to build houses and kind of congregate together, and over time the population increased, more people came, and the city grew. So what you see here, it's very difficult to imagine what this area of the lagoon looked like originally. Some archaeologists have made an attempt to date and trace the original areas of development in the lagoon of Venice, and you could probably imagine it as a series of disconnected islands that ultimately grew into what we see today. It's a collection of 115 islands. And so these islands that we see today are formed through a process of land reclamation, where sand and dirt and silt has been excavated from the lagoon and piled up to make an island. And so this is an extraordinary experiment, really, this construction of these 115 islands. And you can kind of make out in this image that there is this one main thoroughfare, which is the Grand Canal. And this collection here today is connected to the mainland by means of a causeway where car traffic and bikes and pedestrians, but also the train, connects Venice to the mainland. You have to imagine in the period that we're talking about that it was really existing out in the middle of the Adriatic Sea. Initially, when the city really began to develop and had a critical mass of population, the civic center was really in the heart, located over here. But over time, the civic center moved to the location that we see over here. And it's really at the mouth of the Grand Canal. It's almost like the front door of the city. And an interesting aspect of Venice is that it's really not like other cities that we've looked at. When we talk about the urban components of late medieval, early Renaissance cities, we note that the city walls are an important component of definition. Venice never had walls. It was constantly growing. It wasn't practical to build walls because of that constant growth, but also because of the geographic condition. It would have been really difficult to build walls in Venice. And so you might ask yourself, how did they defend themselves? It actually is a result of this unique location in the lagoon. You would think that being surrounded by water, they would be really vulnerable. But the fact is that the water around Venice is very shallow. And it's shocking, actually, to be in Venice and to see people walking out into the lagoon, and it might get to be hip height or chest height, pretty far out into the lagoon. It's very, very shallow. And the Venetians dredged, they dug shipping canals for their boats. And so Venetians really knew how to navigate the lagoon, but foreigners didn't. And so it made it very difficult for foreigners to attack the city because it was not easily navigable, this area of the lagoon. And so if you look at the site of this civic center, you might have the impression that that civic location just at the mouth of the Grand Canal would be highly vulnerable and not protected in the center of the city. But in fact, it was really a statement of Venetian confidence and authority and sailing ability, I would say, that the civic center was founded in that location. In reference to both Siena and Florence last week and the week before, we had talked about how important it is when you're looking at the urban plan to get a sense of the relationship of the church institution and the civic institution and how that plays out in the urban realm. In Venice, it's very particular. So the civic center located here, initially the cathedral of the city was located all the way over one of the first islands to be settled, to be built on. And it too is kind of out there. It's kind of on the edge of the city facing out to the lagoon, but you can see how separate they are. Yes?
I don't know, I can't see the mouse. I don't know.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is there, I wonder if there's another pointer. So, and I'm pretty sure. Do you, oh, okay. Oh, I was using the notebook. Does that show up? No, it's not showing up. It was there momentarily. Maybe if you put it. Okay, awesome. Okay, thanks for letting me know. So here is the Civic Center. Oh, no.
It's two screens, so you have to look at that screen.
I do, but now I'm not seeing the mouse. Oh, there it went. Okay. All right. There is the Civic Center. It was there. That's the Civic Center. Okay, so just at the mouth of the Grand Canal. I don't know why it keeps disappearing. And then this is the original island where the first cathedral was located. I don't know why it's disappearing, so you have to look really quickly when making sure that you're awake, don't blink. So, okay, so this is the cathedral island, and this is the Civic Center. And the original location of the Civic Center was around here, which is where the commercial center ultimately grew up. So over time, the city developed as this series of islands and obviously became much more complex. I'm gonna try to avoid using the mouse from here on out. So the interesting thing about Venice is that geographically, well, one of the interesting things about Venice is that geographically it's located at a kind of crossroads between Northern Europe and Southern Europe, and also between the East and the West. The Venetians ultimately developed this massive maritime empire that stretched almost all the way across Italy to Milan, and then also extended around the Adriatic Sea to the Dalmatian coast. And then Venice also acquired a number of islands throughout the Mediterranean, throughout the Aegean, that it needed strategically for its shipping, for its trading ventures. And so the island of Crete, for example, the island of Cyprus, were at one time Venetian colonies. And so it was great to have all of these possible ports of call while they were moving through this area to trade with the East. This meant that Venice was a place where anything that you desired, anything that you wanted that was known to be available in the world at the time, you could get it in Venice. Just about every good, every item, every material, every fabric, gemstone, pigment, all kinds of goods came through Venice. And this allowed the Venetians to produce an architecture that was very colorful, that was very richly laden with exotic materials. It allowed them to bring into their city architectural elements that were not typical in the rest of Europe at that time, because the Venetians had this exposure farther afield geographically than a lot of the northern Europeans at this time. So I bring this in just to give you a sense how over time Venice became this massive, massive empire, and it made its money through this maritime trade that they engaged in. Focusing on this question of the civic and the religious, I want to look at primarily at two buildings that are located in that main civic square that I tried to point to in that aerial view of the city. This is a painting from the 15th century. Paintings are an outstanding resource to help us understand built fabric that no longer exists. we have to be careful as historians to understand that it's not always a mirror image of what existed, but it can evoke, let's say, what a place might have looked like in a long ago period. So this painting by the Venetian painter Gentile Bellini shows a procession of a relic of the Holy Cross that was owned by a fraternity within, a kind of religious fraternity within the city, and this is them processing their relic in the piazza in front of the major civic church. Now, I want to be really clear about this. It's a little bit confusing because when you look at this church facade, you immediately assume, because of its scale, and you can even tell from this painting that it's a highly elaborate church. This is not the cathedral. Okay? Remember that I tried to show you earlier on that aerial view that the cathedral was actually some distance from this site. It's on another island completely. This church that I'm showing you here was the main civic church. And what I mean by that is that it was basically the chapel of the civic government. And it gained this kind of notoriety and this scale of importance as a result of Venice's acquisition of a really important relic. It was the relic of the Apostle Mark, and I have here a detail from the facade of the church itself, which shows the event which is referred to as the translation of the relics of St. Mark, which means that the Venetians identified these objects, these bones associated with St. Mark, in the city of Alexandria, Egypt. And they basically stole them, although they justified it by saying that they always belonged to them, which they didn't. But they took the relics and they brought them to Venice, and it was a way for Venice to elevate its status, to have the relics of this really important individual, this really important saint. So they brought the relics to Venice, and they built this church to house the relics. Okay? Venice was an important, always was a really important pilgrimage site. Obviously, because of its location, it was a place from which pilgrims often set off to the Holy Land, to Jerusalem. Having the relics of St. Mark even elevated Venice higher in this status as a pilgrimage site. So here what we see is this mosaic representation of the installation of these relics of St. Mark into the building, and it kind of gives us a sense of what the building, obviously it's an interpretation, but what the building might have looked like back in the 10th century. I want to point out too something about the medium of this image. This semester we've looked a lot at, or some at least, at paintings on plaster, frescoes. Can anyone guess why it would not be a good idea to use fresco in a place like Venice? Humidity, absolutely. So you almost never see, they did do some experiments with fresco here in Venice, but they failed miserably because of the humidity. The surface of the wall basically would chip and buckle and flake off. So the Venetians instead gravitated to another medium that was more suitable to their climatic conditions, and also sort of satisfied their local taste for color and texture, and so that medium was mosaic. And basically mosaic is a process of using tiles, small tiles that are colored, and putting them together to make an image. Sometimes these tiles are glass, sometimes they're glazed ceramic. These tiles are actually glass tiles, and they're put together to make this scene. And so it basically makes a hard surface that can really resist the humidity of the city of Venice. And so we see a lot of mosaics in in Venice, and we kind of talked about Mosaic also when we were looking at Hagia Sophia and some of the Carolingian churches. And so you can see that Venice also has this connection to Byzantine architectural traditions as well. So this is the exterior of the building, and of course I've said it's the civic chapel. It's attached, or it's physically attached, and it's also figuratively attached to the civic government. So this is a place where ordinary citizens could come, but they understood that it wasn't the cathedral, it wasn't the seat of the head of the religious institution in the city. As such, I think one of the interesting aspects of the building itself is the way in which it combines the symbolism of Christianity and also civic identity. So there are a couple of details here. First of all, and the slide doesn't show it in very clearly. I would lower the lights, but then you wouldn't be able to see. The building is completely clad in book-matched marble of various colors. And this marble, obviously, you're not quarrying marble in the Venetian lagoon. So all of these materials come from somewhere else. There are spoils that come from buildings all over the Mediterranean and beyond, North Africa and even farther east, where the Venetians would take materials and they would bring them back and they would apply them to this building. And it gives the building this extraordinary color, texture. It's highly varied. The kind of design value that we place today on a kind of coherence of material and standards like symmetry and things like that, those were not so important to the Venetians. Instead, they wanted this building to communicate their connection to these far-flung locations that they were attached to through their trade and through their colonies. A nice detail that communicates this, that has no religious significance at all, are these 4 horses. They're bronze, but they've been gilded, so they have this kind of gold sheen to them. These 4 horses, which came from the hippodrome of the city of Constantinople. So they date from a Roman period, and they were taken and they were placed almost as trophies on the front of the church. Again, no religious significance at all. The square where this building is located is referred to as Piazza San Marco. It takes its name from the church, which is dedicated to St. Mark. Over time, this square the edges of the square began to be defined by loggia that corresponded to civic offices. You can imagine that for an empire the size of Venice's, the bureaucracy was vast. There was this huge administrative state bureaucracy that existed to take care of the legalities, the trading, the taxes, judicial application, all of these things, and the offices were organized around the square in the spaces that you see defined around this rectangle. And I want to add here that at one point you have the basilica at the top, you have the piazza. There was a line of buildings here with faced by a loggia and closed spaces up above, which is where the offices were. Eventually, in the 16th century, this wing was built, and it's basically a mirror image of this one. And the idea was that next to, you can see in this plan that next to the basilica is a building called the Palazzo Ducale. That is the city hall. And actually, let me go back again. So one of the things, this isn't a great plan in the sense that it's not showing it's kind of isolating these urban elements as objects in space. It's not showing you where the edge of the site is. Basically, where this image ends, you can imagine water. Okay? So the town hall faces the water, but it also faces land. So that spot where you see it says Piazzetta, that's the land piazza, and then the town hall also faces to the water. So you're kind of seeing that here. This is the land face here, and then this face over here faces toward the lagoon, toward the water. And it's so important to understand in Venice that the water functions just like a street. So the canals are like streets that you navigate by boat, and the lagoon that comes up to the town hall is a place where people would gather, and they would use it like a piazza, but they would gather in their boats. Okay? So one of the things that you see here on this town hall, which is idiosyncratically, uniquely Venetian, there are these two balconies, one facing the land side piazza, and the other one facing the water, so that the government could appear to people who were gathered in the water piazza, let's say, in front of the building. Now, one thing I want to say about this structure is you see that it's called the Palazzo Ducale. So it suggests that it is the palace of a duke. And when you see that nomenclature, you may be thinking, wait a minute, you've been saying that these are Republican governments, that they are democracies. How can it be the palace of a duke? A duke is a single figurehead, or a figure. The name of there was a person at the head of the government in Venice who was elected. He was referred to as the Doge. His name is here on the screen, Doge, D-O-G-E, Doge. And the Doge was kind of like a single figurehead at the head of the government. But he wasn't like like a dictator. He really was just sort of a ceremonial head of the government. This town hall was the place where he lived. This was also the place where the legislators would meet. And so in Venice, you know, each one of these town halls, they take their own name that is idiosyncratic to the town. And in this case, the Palazzo Ducale is the Doge's palace, but I don't want you to be confused. It was an elected republic. If you look at this building, you also see that it's different from the town halls in Siena and Florence in the sense that it's so open. And this is consistent with the site condition that I was talking about a little bit earlier. Venice really felt it was unassailable. It had a high degree of confidence, and the openness of its town hall communicates this. So you can see that the lower level here is it's this loggia, and even the second level has a loggia that is open. It's kind of an exterior hallway beyond which are meeting rooms with large windows at the top to, again, communicate this idea of transparency. Yeah, they didn't want anyone to have the sense that shady, sketchy dealings were going on behind the scenes. They wanted to communicate the openness of the government. Bless you. And here you can see, this is the view from the lagoon toward the Palazzo Ducale. In this case, the bell tower is separate from the building. It's monumental, it's larger, it may be the largest campanile in Italy, and it's a separate independent structure, and you kind of see it behind the town hall here. And just as a point of reference, the campanile that you see here today in the 19th century actually collapsed, completely collapsed, and it was reconstructed as it was on the site where it was originally found. So it's not the original campanile, but it's a replica of it. And then finally, just to extend this idea of the overlapping of the civic and the religious in this period, I wanted to show you a detail of a sculpture from the Capitals around the base of the town hall, the Palazzo Ducale in Venice, where we see a number of sculptures that represent religious themes. This connects back to what we talked about when we were looking at Siena, and I was showing you the idea of representations of virtues and vices, and the recollection to legislators that they were obliged to be virtuous in their government so that the people could trust them and the government would be just and stable. And so this is a detail of one of the corner pillars at the town hall showing the drunkenness of Noah. And the idea was to remind them, to remind the legislators to always be mindful of their responsibility, to be in control of their passions, to be disciplined and thoughtful and reflective about their work as legislators, and not to lose control of themselves. And so these sculptures line the facade of the building, on one hand as a reminder to the legislators who worked in the building, but also as a reference to the people of the model that they should hold their legislators to. Now I'm going to switch gears and return us to Florence. Before I leave Venice, are there any questions? So when we talk about the 15th century in Italy, we refer to this period as the Renaissance. And I mentioned this, I've been mentioning this for the last couple of weeks, and your reading discusses it as well. This term, the Renaissance, refers to rebirth. And the thing that is being reborn in this context is classical culture. We've talked a lot about the importance of Roman roots and the reference of cities to a Roman past. Remember that they really wanted to claim some kind of connection to ancient Rome, which was this sort of model of civilization, not just of civic government, but of culture, a flowering of history, philosophy, science, knowledge in general, literature, the arts, architecture. And so what is being reborn in this period is this classical culture. However, I think that we can learn so much from from Renaissance architects about how to engage with precedent. Because yes, they were looking to the classical past, but whenever we think about that relationship to the past and the precedents that they were looking at, we need to ask ourselves a couple of questions. First of all, which classicism? So if we ask which classicism, it could be Republican Rome, it could be Imperial Rome, it could be early Christian Rome, and those cultural contexts matter. So it's not just a formal borrowing from the past. All of those forms that they're addressing, that they're engaging, come with baggage. They come with cultural associations. And that goes for you too. As architects, you can identify a precedent, but you have to understand you can't just borrow forms like it's a catalog and paste them together like it's a piñata. You have to think about that context. And so, which classicism? Okay, that's the first question. And you want to ask yourself why, how, based on what criteria did an architect select a precedent? And then the other thing that I want to point out about this engagement with the classical past is that it was never a copy. It was never the idea to look at a classical monument and replicate it. And so there's a critical operation that has to happen. It's an interpretation of particular elements that serve a new cultural context. And so this also is an important model when you look at precedents to kind of consider. When you look at something that is informing your work or informing your design thinking, you have to ask yourself what you want to do with it. You're not copying, you interpret that thing and make it your own. You translate it. It's sort of like a translation project. You put it into a new language. And so I want you to think about that as we're looking at Renaissance and Baroque architecture in the coming weeks. This period of the Renaissance, as I was saying, is a period of heightened intellectual engagement where, yes, people were looking to the classical past, they were looking at literature, they were looking at the arts, they were looking at history. And at the same time, we see advances in scientific knowledge, in empirical thought, which means that people were trying to find rational explanations for the world around them. So before this is a bit simplistic, but before this period, it was more culturally acceptable to kind of look at the world around you and explain it through religion. Now, in this period, scientific investigation and empirical knowledge, rational testing of information came to the fore. And as in relationship to that, in architecture, we see the development of architectural theory that is highly complex, highly intellectualized, and even codified, which means that it's written down in texts that are circulated, and architectural knowledge is shared as a way of making consistent standards not only among architects, but also among patrons. These treatises had the effect of explaining to architects what good practice was, what kinds of standards they should aspire to, but the idea also was to educate patrons so that they would recognize high standards of practice as well. So one of the things that we're going to be looking at for the remainder of the week is how Renaissance architects connected theory and practice. How did they use this theoretical investigation and attempt to inform the buildings that they actually built? So the first example that I'm going to show you in this regard is from Filippo Brunelleschi. Remember that he was the architect of the dome of Florence Cathedral. This project of completing the dome of the cathedral, which we talked about before, was a massive, significant accomplishment on his part, made his reputation. Once he started working on that project, he was the most desirable architect in the city of Florence, and many, many different patrons attracted him or tried to commission him for work. One of the early projects that he did, or that he began while he was working on the Florence Cathedral, was a project in this space. The space itself is called Piazza Santissima Annunziata. I'm not going to ask you to identify this space, but it's associated with the church at the top of the slide there, which is dedicated to the Annunciation. And the project that Brunelleschi was commissioned to produce was an orphanage located here. All of these two cloisters here and this loggia that face onto the piazza, that building was an orphanage. The piazza itself was regularized and completed with the addition of a kind of a mirror image of the facade of the Foundling Hospital, or of the orphanage on the other side in the 16th century. So this is the facade of this building. I'm calling it an orphanage. Most of the time you'll see it referred to as the Foundling Hospital. I'm fine with you calling it orphanage, because that's essentially what it was. It was a place where orphans, young boys and girls, usually infants, were taken when their parents abandoned them. This was a really important institution with social significance in the city of Florence. And the project was initiated by the Silk Guild. Remember that we talked about how in Florence, the guilds, the trade unions, had a very important patronage role in the city. And so it was the Silk Guild that initiated the construction of this institution. One of the things we haven't talked too much about yet in class is the differences in gender roles. In this period, women of very high status basically had two possible avenues to pursue in life. One was to be a wife, and one was to be a nun. Basically, women were they were used as tools for their families to make advantageous political and economic connections. And so a woman would grow up knowing that she had to represent her family at all times. If any of her behavior embarrassed the family or shamed the family in any way, her marriage options would decline dramatically. So the men in the family, this is for elite women, the men in the family would sequester women within the family home. They were basically enclosed, and whenever they went outside the home, they had to be accompanied by a male relative or an older female relative. And the idea was that they were constantly under surveillance so that their virtue, their reputation, could never be called into question and damage their chances of being married. So you can imagine in this context, if a woman got pregnant without being married, it was something that the family definitely wanted to hide. They didn't want that information being public. And as a consequence, there was a fairly high incidence of child abandonment in Florence, thereby pointing out the importance of an institution like this. So it's an extension of this ideology that used women to make these political, social, and economic attachments. Just as an aside, usually these women were able to go on and make a marriage match even though they had given birth. The family would keep that secret to the husband while they were negotiating the marriage. So this institution here that we're looking at, this really was a place where these abandoned infants would be taken. So here's Brunelleschi. He's looking at this design problem. Think of it as you have this design problem. This is a building type that really did not exist. This is a modern building type. Where do you go to look for a precedent? There wasn't another hospital. There weren't, there wasn't a typology of hospital at this time. In addition, Brunelleschi was definitely engaged in contemporary debates about architectural theory. So when he's thinking about a language for this building, not just the organization of it, the composition of it, the spatial scheme of it, but the language, the specific language of the building, he looks at ancient Rome. Brunelleschi had traveled to Rome. He drew extensively there. He made measurements there. He was a very, very careful student of ancient architecture. And he came back to Florence and applied the language of that classical architecture to this building. I'll come back to this view in a second, but I want to show you the plan of the building. I told you that this was an institution for both boys and girls, and they would grow up in this orphanage. So they might arrive there as orphans, as infants, but they would grow up in this institution and then ultimately be placed in trades, or they would be married off or sent to a convent. So boys and girls in this institution were separated, and you can tell right away by looking at this plan that the organization of a monastery was a kind of spatial referent for Brunelleschi. There are these two cloisters. The larger one in the middle is the boys' cloister, and then the smaller one, the rectangular one on the right-hand side of the plan, that was the girls' cloister. Boys and girls had separate churches, they had separate refectories, they were really kept, they were almost side by side parallel institutions. So the monastery became a worthwhile precedent for Brunelleschi. Obviously the orphans aren't doing the kind of work that monks did, and so some of the spaces like a chapter room, for example, didn't exist in the orphanage, but the organization really, I think, made sense for the orphanage. Probably the main innovation, let's say, that Brunelleschi brought to this interpretation of the monastic model is the addition on the facade of this loggia space. And you can kind of see how it's organized at the front of the building with stairs at the front that reach down into the piazza, and then make a porch at the front of the building. This porch is almost like a waiting room. It's like it's a place where that mediates between the public and the private. You can imagine that people who are coming to the orphanage, who are delivering a child, they don't necessarily want to be seen by the public. And so this porch, this loggia on the front of the building, served that purpose of allowing someone to go up the steps and to disappear really into that porch structure. This is a view from that porch facing the end wall. And if you don't mind, I would like to lower the lights, and I'll turn them back up, but I want to lower them so that you can see the image a little bit better. At the end of this loggia, I don't know if you can make it out, there's a little window here, up here. That window was the place where people would abandon their children. So, or actually, it was usually a servant who would deliver the child to the orphanage. Inside this window was a cabinet, a turning cabinet, and with a separation in the middle. And you could put the baby in the cabinet and turn the cabinet, and your identity would remain anonymous. Cold, right? And so this window is blocked up now, and it's kind of a small detail. People who go to this building today don't really even pay attention to that window, but it is this reminder of the social past, I think, of this building. It's a really, really important structure historically. I want to say a little bit about the theoretical approach of Brunelleschi to primarily we're going to focus on the facade of the building. Brunelleschi used these classical elements and he applied them in a way that was mathematically rigorous. He concentrated on perfect geometry. So we're talking about squares that were perfectly symmetrical, where the measurements were consistent all the way around, and circles, which had this perfect symmetry. And the loggia, this arcade here, this colonnade at the front of the building, employs squares and circles. So you can see that there are circles overhead in the vaults of each of the bays of this portico. But if you also look at the bays of the facade, you can see that this is a square and this is a half circle. And so he uses these perfect geometries to allow the design to cohere and apply this very rigorous measurement so that the building is consistent. And you can see that in this design, he has centered the windows of the upper story over each one of these bays. In between each of these arches, the spandrels of the arches, he puts these round panels. They're called rondels, R-O-N-D-E-L. And they allow you to kind of measure or count the number of bays along the facade, it's kind of another element that he uses to kind of tie the whole composition together. They're more decorative, obviously, than the other classical elements that we see in the facade. Interestingly, with Renaissance architecture, because theoretically architects did want to engage with rigorous standards, they wanted to measure, they wanted to emphasize these perfect geometries. Historians who look back on the Renaissance want to see this image of perfection. And the fact is that in execution, there wasn't always this fact of perfection. And so what happens at the Foundling Hospital that we're looking at here is that Brunelleschi was famous for taking a really long time on his jobs because he was so meticulous. Often material would come to the site, he would refuse it and send it back because it wasn't cut properly or it wasn't measured exactly right, and he would send it back to the quarry or to the stonemasons, and his projects took a really, really long time. And when that happened, sometimes his clients wouldn't pay him. And on this particular job, Brunelleschi was not being paid, and he quit. He quit the job. And so what happened is that the Silk Guild said, fine, you know, you're leaving the job, we're going to find someone else to finish it, which they did. They hired someone from the Silk Guild who had no architectural background at all, was not a stonecutter, didn't know about the theories that Brunelleschi, or the system that Brunelleschi was applying. And so this guy from the Silk Guild, his name was Francesco della Luna, he completed the project. And what appears to be very simple is in fact very difficult, because this guy really didn't understand the system. And so here are a couple of examples of how Francesco della Luna finished the facade of the Foundling Hospital. You can see this last bay here. There are a couple of ways it looks a little bit like a traffic jam. There are these two rondels that kind of clash at this colossal pilaster. And the detail I think that is the most telling is what happens at the very end of the bay. So, theoretically, I want you guys to think about the classical system. Think about the classical past. And remember that we talked about way back when we were looking at the Parthenon, we were talking about how the classical system executed in stone may have been a representation of a wooden architecture. Remember that? And so the entablature was like a beam. So here what we have is Brunelleschi with his entablature. You can kind of see the fascia of the entablature running along horizontally. But the guy, Francesco della Luna, who follows him in this project, clearly doesn't understand that tectonic language. Look what happens when you get to the very end. He allows that molding to turn the corner and go vertical. Here. It's like the beam was bent and was made into a column. So this is a small thing, okay? It's a small thing, but it is just intended to explain to you that there is a system, and to apply the system, you have to understand it. It comes with background, it comes with associations, and if you think of it only as a decorative language, the logic is lost, okay? And so interestingly, in relationship to the Foundling Hospital, when you see it photographed, and you know, you can go to Google Images and look for images of the facade. Often, when it's photographed, the last bay is actually cut off. Because they want to propagate this mythology of the perfection of Renaissance architecture, which, when it was executed, was actually very messy. Not perfect. So, we're going to continue with Brunelleschi, and I want to talk about a couple of his other projects that happened, or that he built in Florence, as I was saying, he really was the go-to architect after he finished the dome of the cathedral. And students always ask me, because they know that I've done research in Florence, when they're traveling to Florence, they will often ask me, where should I go? I have like 4 hours or something. Where should I go? And I always tell them to go to San Lorenzo, this church that we're looking at here, because it's this kind of laboratory that includes the sort of A to Z of Renaissance architectural practice. This building is extremely important in the history of Florence. It was one of the oldest churches that existed, probably coeval or just about the same time as the original cathedral. By the 15th century, this church had really fallen into disrepair, and people around the neighborhood of this church decided that they were going to group together as a group of patrons and contribute to the renovation, the reconstruction, the beautification of this building. When we talk about looking to the classical past, this building is really looking back to the early Christian classical past. Okay, so you know that an early Christian church typically takes a basilica plan, has a Latin cross plan, longitudinal nave, transepts, and you can basically see that in the massing from this aerial view, right? You can kind of identify that model in the organization of this building. One of the things that this group of patrons decided to do was elaborate that plan by adding into the plan of the building, all along the nave, chapels. So they were going to introduce chapels along the nave and around the transepts, and each family would have its own chapel. And basically it was a way to divide up the real estate of the church, and each family would basically purchase a bay. Okay? And they would that way be able to complete the whole church. So while this project was underway, one of the things that happened in Florence is that the city went to war. And the city really relied on its wealthiest citizens to fund this war effort. And as a result, many of the families that were involved in this project could not deliver on their promise to buy a part of the church. And so one family came to the rescue, and I put rescue kind of in quotes. The family was the Medici family, and they were prominent bankers. They were extremely wealthy. They were wealthier than all of their other neighbors. And they went to the city and they said, we will bail out, we'll bail out the city, we'll pay the city, we'll fund the war effort, and in exchange, we would like you to give us the sole patronage rights to this church, which they did. And so there remain a handful of chapels that were bought by other neighbors, but basically this became a Medici-funded church. It was a public church. It didn't technically belong to them, but they were the patrons. They were the main patrons of the building. So the building itself, we're going to talk about the building itself, but the first and most important part of this building for Brunelleschi and for the Medici is the sacristy. So the sacristy, because my pointer's not working, I'm going to, here's the nave of the church, and you can see here each of these chapels that belong to each one of these families, and they stretch all the way around the transepts. The sacristy is the space at the top of the slide that comes off of the transept there at the top on the left, okay? So the sacristy. The sacristy is the space in the church where all of the priests' ritual clothing is kept. All of the instruments that are used in the Mass, the ritual, all of those things are stored in the sacristy. And the Medici initially decided that they were going to begin their patronage of this chapel, of the Church of San Lorenzo, with their commission of this sacristy. It's called the Old Sacristy. this makes sense, this is logical, right? So the first one is the old sacristy, and then later they built a new sacristy on the other side of the building. Brunelleschi, again, relies on perfect geometries, the square, the circle. He uses them as modules that allow the building, when he executes them and applies them in the building, he uses them to make the building coherent and consistent, logical, rational. He wants to make a building that through its form, through its detail, allows the person who enters into it to see with their own eyes the logic of the space. It's not enough for him to be informed by logic. He wants the experience to be logical. He wants people to see that with their eyes and be able to confirm it empirically, that this is a logical space that was systematically designed using these measurements and using these perfect geometries, which are repeated over and over. So in this case, the main module of the building is the square of this chapel. And this square in the larger space here is replicated 9 times. It's a 9-square grid. Okay. And then on the elevation, he also is using squares. He's replicating these squares to kind of solidify and lock in the logic of the elevation. He uses material as a way of reinforcing your reading of the building, of the space. So there are 2 main materials. One is plaster. It's this white surface which shows you the infill of the wall. The second material is a gray stone. That gray stone, I know it's discussed in the book. I'll spell it for you. It's Pietra Serena, Pietra, which means stone. Serena, Serena. So there's a system in which the white represents, is kind of reflects the wall, the surface of the wall. It's like a visual datum, kind of infill. And then he uses the Pietra Serena, this gray limestone, to represent these classical elements that he's applying to an interior condition. So think about that for a minute. When we talked about classical architecture and the application of the classical orders, do you recall that, I mean, I can't really think of many cases, with the possible exception of early Christian churches, where the classical system was applied to an interior condition? So here, like from the beginning, we have Brunelleschi using classical elements in a situation that we typically don't see them applied to an interior space. What's happening here is he is using the Pietra Serena to represent a structural system that is embedded in the wall. So if you imagine a wall, and the supports of the wall are columns. Maybe you imagine that there are columns embedded in the wall. These columns, you're not going to see them on the surface of the wall. So he wants you to see the logic of the space, and he projects that with these pilasters, these gray pilasters that are attached to the surface of the wall. They represent structure. They're not structure, but they represent structure. Does that make sense? Okay. So just one last thing, and then I'm going to let you go, but this is an important point. So one of the things that happens in this room is that you see that there's this entablature that runs all the way around the room. And it unites this whole composition. Inside that frieze are these little roundels. They actually have little baby faces in them. And those roundels, they seem decorative. They are decorative. But if one wanted to, you could count those roundels and verify mathematically the modules that I was referring to, so that the measurement of one side of the chapel is multiplied in the larger space of the sacristy as a module. So he's not leaving it up to chance. You know what I'm saying? That he really wants you to be able to look at it and understand logically, intellectually, through your eyes, verify the system. There's one last element that I want to describe here for you, in which his precision of execution of this system really comes to the fore. And unfortunately, I don't have great slides to explain it to you, so you're going to have to kind of bear with me. If you look at the long side of the sacristy, you see that there's this broad span. So visually speaking, tectonically, your eye wants something to support that span. It's so long. But he doesn't want to break up the wall with pilasters. And so instead, he supports that entablature with these brackets. So you can kind of see them there on the flanking wall there. Brunelleschi was so precise about wanting to communicate the tectonic language of this building that the bracket, which is a kind of vegetal form, has leaves at the top of it. And the leaves of that bracket cup up around that, the fascia of that entablature, showing you visually that the job that it does is supporting. It shows it as it's holding that entablature. In the chapel, notice that he uses the bracket again. If you look in the back of the chapel where the crucifix is, there's this molding that makes an arch. And at the top of that arch, there's another bracket. What's that bracket doing? That bracket isn't holding up a broad span. It's a small span. The bracket there is functioning as a keystone in the arch. And as a consequence, instead of cupping the leaves up, he folds them back. It's a small detail, but that shows you the kind of level of invention and kind of criticality and precision that he's bringing to this tectonic language. So I'm going to stop there, and then we'll pick up, we'll kind of review the old sacristy at the beginning of church class on Thursday and continue with the lesson.